Hello to everybody in Basel and everywhere else. It's my pleasure to be able to join you today to celebrate Albert Hofmann's discovery of the psychedelic properties of LSD 75 years ago. It's a wonderful thing that he did, and we've all benefited from his discovery enormously, and so have millions of people. And so I think it's very fitting that we gather now 75 years later to try to assess what were the benefits, what were the risks, how has our culture reacted, and to chart the way forward so that instead of being a problem child, it's more of a wonder child, which is what Albert Hofmann wanted to see. And so I think one of the main vehicles for that is going to be medicalization. And so I'll speak with you today briefly about where we're at with the medicalization of MDMA and what we've learned from that as it applies to trying to figure out how to medicalize LSD. I think it'd be quite difficult to get religious freedom for LSD. You have to create a new religion that's centered around LSD. It's not impossible. It has been done for peyote. It has been done for ayahuasca. But those were long traditions of the use of those drugs. And so I think religious freedom for LSD will come only after legalization, and legalization will come after medicalization. So where we're at with MDMA is we're on the verge of phase 3 studies. Phase 3 are the large-scale studies designed to prove safety and efficacy and are the final required step prior to getting prescription approval. So I started MAPS in 1986. It took us that's 32 years ago. It took us 6 years to get permission for the first dose-response phase 1 safety study, starting in 1992 with Dr. Charles Grob. That took us till around 1996. Then we tried to move forward into patient populations, and 1999 is when we were able to start the first study with MDMA for PTSD in Spain with women survivors of childhood sexual abuse and adult rape and assault. That study was unfortunately blocked politically by the Madrid anti-drug authority after we had some good publicity, after we had just a few people enrolled. Starting in 2004, we were able to start the first study in the U.S. With MDMA for PTSD. Shortly after, we were able to work with Peter Owen and Verena Widmer in Switzerland to do an MDMA PTSD study there. Then we were able to start research in Israel and Canada and back into the U.S. It took us 16 years basically to get to the end of phase 2 meeting, which we had with FDA November 29th, 2016, and FDA gave us permission to move to phase 3. At that point, we entered into a long, detailed process called the Special Protocol Assessment process, which I would recommend for anybody trying to medicalize LSD. And that's where you negotiate with the regulatory agency, with the FDA, and you end up negotiating every aspect of the protocol design and also all the other data that the regulatory agency would like to see before they approve the drug. And if you get an agreement letter in the Special Protocol Assessment process, that binds the FDA to approve the drug if you get statistically significant evidence of efficacy and if no new safety problems arise. And so that's what we have been successful in. And then as of July 28th, 2017, FDA gave us permission, gave us an agreement letter in the Special Protocol Assessment. And then we went beyond that and we asked for breakthrough therapy. In Europe, that's called PRIME. It's for the most promising drugs, and we weren't sure we were going to get it. We knew we qualified for it, but it's very public, and so one concern is that the FDA might have been worried if they give us breakthrough therapy and the DEA finds out about it, or President Trump or Attorney General Sessions finds out about it, and then they might be upset about the FDA. So we were a little bit worried about politics and science, but as it turns out, on August 15th, 2017, FDA gave us breakthrough therapy. And then we've since had 2 meetings with the DEA, one on DEA on December 19th, and then FDA again under breakthrough therapy on December 20th to really refine some final details about moving into phase 3. So now we're all set to move into phase 3. And then during the last few months, we've been exceptionally lucky and have been able to raise a whole bunch of money, about $10 million. And so now we have raised $26.2 million of the $26.7 million we think we need for FDA approval. And we're negotiating with the European Medicines Agency. We had our first teleconference on March 1st, and on April 5th we submitted the documents for what's called the scientific advice process. We'll probably have a meeting in person in the middle of June, and then by the end of the summer, we think we'll have come to agreement with the EMA. Currently, we're estimating we're going to need about another $5 million, and we have $400,000 of that already for bringing MDMA to Europe. So we're also working with people who are trying to bring MDMA to China. We shipped MDMA to Brazil. There's a study to train therapists there that's going to start. So we're basically going global. And I would totally recommend that as well for the medicalization of LSD, because once you've got data enough for FDA or EMA, the marginal costs of getting additional data for the other regulatory agency are very minimal. So what have we learned from this whole process of working with MDMA that applies to LSD? So in order to medicalize LSD, the first thing that you need is LSD. But what we've learned is that you need not just these small supplies that we were able to use for Peter Gasser's study, or for Robin Card-Harris doing studies in England with neuroscience, looking at LSD and the default mode network and all. But what you need is a GMP. You need a good manufacturing practices. You need a supply that can be marketed as a prescription medicine should the research work out. And to create that will cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $500,000 to $1 million. It's outrageous. What can you say? It's outrageous. But that's what it costs to get a standardized supply. And the reason, there's a two-part aspect to it. The first part is creating the drug, but then the second part is creating the delivery system. So whether it's put it into capsules or put on pills or put on sugar cubes or whatever it's going to be, there's a two-part process. And so that, I would say, is the most important prerequisite, is to begin with the LSD. Then the question is, what do you study? The phase 2 studies are designed to figure out all the different things you need in order to start phase 3. So if we look at the literature with LSD, there was a fair number of early reports about LSD for cancer patients with anxiety. And in fact, when we were able to start LSD research again for the first time in over 35 years with Peter Gasser's study, that was LSD for people with anxiety from life-threatening diseases. And people have a lot of compassion for people from life-threatening diseases. However, I wouldn't recommend that for LSD. And the reason is because there's going to be several different studies looking at psilocybin for cancer patients with depression, or for depression from any cause. And one of these is going to be done by USONA Institute in the United States in a nonprofit context, and they're going to be trying to go to Europe as well. And then there's Compass Pathways in Europe that's working in a for-profit context, and they're going to be coming to the U.S. as well. So this is for depression. Anxiety is something different, but I think it's similar enough that it would be good to try to find some other indication for LSD. And my recommendation, you might think PTSD. The early work was the very first psychedelic used for PTSD was LSD by Dr. Bastiaans in the Netherlands, and that was quite helpful to a lot of people. The Israeli Holocaust writer Katsetnik went to Dr. Bastiaans and underwent LSD therapy and wrote the book Shaviti about it. But LSD doesn't have that fear reduction aspect that MDMA does, and the experiences are really difficult for people to work through, even with tremendous support. So I don't think that LSD for PTSD would be my first choice. And thinking about it, I would recommend alcoholism. I think there's alcoholism all over the world. Early work with LSD and multiple studies have shown effectiveness. There's been a meta-analysis done that showed effectiveness. So I think there's a lot of need for new treatments for addiction, and I think LSD for alcoholism would be a really good choice. There is an MDMA study that Dr. Ben Sessa is starting now for alcoholism. There's been some work with psilocybin for alcoholism. You know, ayahuasca has been used for the treatment of addiction. Peyote has been used for alcoholism, and but none of these are efforts moving into phase 3. And so I would think alcoholism would be one good way to start. Then the other question is the dose, and this is what we'll be needing to find out in the phase 2 studies. But in our study with LSD, with anxiety, with life-threatening illnesses, the top dose was 200 micrograms, and then the low dose comparator dose was 20 micrograms. And we'll need to confirm this with Peter Gesser, what he's thinking about it now, but my sense of it is that a dose higher than 200 micrograms would be better, something like 250 to 300 micrograms. And the low dose should be a little bit higher, I think, than 20 micrograms. And now this is if we're trying to create a double blind with a sufficient confusion so people know they're tripping, but they don't get as much therapeutic benefits. And we tried this with MDMA, and what we learned is that the low doses of MDMA actually had an anti-therapeutic effect, in that they activated people, didn't reduce the fear, and what we found is that the actual therapy with inactive placebo did better than therapy with low-dose MDMA. So low-dose MDMA had an anti-therapeutic effect. I don't know that that would be the same with LSD, but that would be an important part of the phase 2 studies, trying to figure out what is the appropriate control condition. And is it inactive placebo, or would it be low-dose LSD? So I think that would be really important. Then the other issue is how many sessions? What is the treatment? The psilocybin projects are a 1-dose treatment. Our MDMA is a 3-dose treatment, 1 month apart, supplemented by, for us, 12 non-drug psychotherapy sessions. So my recommendation would be not to get away from this 1-dose miracle cure kind of thinking. And it does make it more expensive, but I do think at least 2 sessions would be an appropriate design. And I think that's really based on some of the things that we've learned, is that people tend to go deeper in the second session than in the first session, that they build the therapeutic alliance, they understand more about the drug, and so they can go pretty deep in the second session. So, and then how many preparation sessions, how many integration sessions, that of non-drug psychotherapy, that's all to be determined. I think the other issue is going to be what's the outcome measure. And so fortunately in this regard, both the European Medicines Agency and the FDA have guidance documents on developing drugs for alcoholism, and they both recommend monitoring heavy drinking days, the number of heavy drinking days before and after. So they're not going for abstinence. You can be looking at that, that's important, but more realistically is to look for reduction in heavy drinking days, because people sometimes do relapse. Also, you're going to have to really standardize the therapy. So you're going to need to create a treatment manual that describes the therapy. Now, Stan Grof has written the whole textbook on LSD psychotherapy. You don't need to make it enormous, but you need to have a treatment manual that everybody more or less follows. You need to have adherence criteria so that raters can watch the videotapes and score therapists on how they adhere to the manual. This doesn't mean that there's only one approach once the drug is approved. Once the drug is approved, once LSD is approved as a medicine, probably the only people to prescribe it will be people that have been trained in the method used in phase 3, but then they can innovate. So I think you're going to need to develop a treatment manual, and I think that's really important, and I think that's not yet happened really even for the psilocybin, although that's underway. You're going to need to review all of the world's literature on LSD and create an investigator's brochure. Again, it's time consuming and expensive, but not that complicated, because it's very clear that LSD is physiologically safe, and that we need to be aware of the psychological conditions, but with support, LSD can be administered safely in a clinical setting. So you need to have somebody working on this investigator's brochure. Then I think something that's very important is that we're going to need multiple different therapists. So we're going to have to start talking about therapy training programs. I know that you already have some in Switzerland, and there's a bunch of therapists throughout Europe, but really there are, many tens of millions of alcoholics, or whatever condition we're looking at. So we're going to need thousands and thousands of therapists. So you need to really focus on what is your therapy training program and how do you set that up. And then the final thing is fundraising. I'm guessing that it would be roughly $30 million from start to finish to take LSD through the system. And that's an awful lot of money. And so where is that money going to come from? Well, that's a good question. But hopefully, the 75th anniversary of LSD is here. People are going to be talking about what they've learned from it, what societies have learned for it, what our hopes are for LSD for the future. And so hopefully from that enthusiasm, we'll be able to find the resources. And one thing that I've learned from MDMA, obviously, is that you don't need to have all the money at the beginning. Just develop a plan, go step by step, and each step you get more credibility, more connections, and then it gets, even though the amounts of money you need to raise are larger and larger, it gets easier and easier to raise that money. So that's what we've learned about developing psychedelics into regulatory approved prescription medicines. I'm honored and pleased and delighted to be able to share some moments with you on this 75th anniversary of the discovery of LSD. Bye for now.